Welcome back to The Deep Dive, where we synthesize your source material and provide a critical shortcut to understanding the most complex and compelling figures in history and culture.
Today, we are undertaking a deep dive into the magnetic, revolutionary, and yet deeply traditional mind of Sorley MacLean.
Eimhir MacDiarmid, a man who didn't just write poetry in Gaelic. He seems to have completely redefined what Gaelic poetry was even capable of.
That's the key distinction, really. MacLean is absolutely pivotal in 20th century literature because he operated as this kind of cultural and intellectual bridge.
A bridge between what, exactly?
Well, he took the deep, intense, often isolated traditions of the Scottish Highlands.
So it's history, it's language.
All of it.
Right.
The martial music, the intense geography.
Yeah.
And he slammed them right up against the biggest ideological and aesthetic movements of 20th century Europe.
So you talk about things like radical Marxism, the reality of the Spanish Civil War.
Exactly. And the fragmentation of literary modernism. It's a collision.
Okay, so let's try and unpack this complex synthesis. Our mission for this deep dive is rooted in the sources you've shared with us.
Right.
We need to explore the specific tapestry of his influences. I mean, how did his intense, lifelong grounding in Celtic studies, the Gaelic language and tradition, first clash with, and then, ultimately synthesize with these uncompromising demands of radical European politics?
And also with the aesthetic challenges posed by figures like T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound.
Right.
And we really have to begin by acknowledging a crucial difficulty here.
Which is?
We're discussing MacLean's work primarily through the filter English translation.
Of course.
And critical analysis that's also written in English. Now, this is necessary, to open his work up to a wider audience. But any discussion like ours has to accept that the true depth, the real texture of his linguistic achievement.
You mean the almost archaeological work he did with the Gaelic language itself?
Precisely. That is necessarily diluted the moment it crosses that language barrier.
So we can appreciate the history, the ideas, the structure, but we're always going to lose some of the music in translation.
Inevitably.
That sets a pretty serious intellectual challenge for us. Let's begin at the beginning then. On the remote Isle of Raasay, where the foundations of this identity, which sounds paradoxical from the start, were forged. Sorley MacLean was born in 1911 in the township of Osgag, on the west coast of Raasay. And this wasn't just a geographical location, was it? It was more of an ancestral and cultural repository.
It absolutely was. Raasay, though it might seem picturesque to us, was an island community that was really struggling with decline.
Decline in what sense?
Well, while it maintained a strong communal cultural identity, the Gaelic way of life was reeling from the legacy of the 19th century clearances.
And emigration, I assume.
And persistent emigration, yes. But the thing is, MacLean himself benefited from an extraordinary, almost archival, familial culture. He was kind of insulated from that immediate economic decay by this incredible wealth of inherited knowledge.
Let's get into the specifics of that.
Yeah.
We hear about songs, stories, and history. But what truly distinguished the cultural education he was getting at home?
He was just steeped in it. A comprehensive cultural education passed down orally, experientially by his parents, his grandmother, aunts, uncles. And this wasn't just folklore,
It was more structured.
Much more. It included songs, tunes, high-status poetry, and crucially, a deep knowledge of clan mythologies and genealogical history.
I read that he could trace his family back 6 generations.
6 generations. And he absorbed practical traditional skills, too. There was something called sprada reached.
Which is what?
It's the highly nuanced traditional Gaelic art of weather forecasting, based entirely on observing natural signs.
Wow.
So this entire package gave him, as the sources really emphasize, a deeply satisfying sense of being part of something larger than himself.
A self-sufficient, self-confident entity.
Exactly. Deeply rooted in Raasay and Skye and long of memory. And this gave him an alternative, intensely local, and historically coherent narrative that was in sharp contrast to the official story being taught in the schools.
So he has this formidable internal archive of Gaelic tradition, but the external reality was that the forces shaping his community were often hostile to that very tradition.
Right.
And this takes us directly to the overwhelming presence of the church.
Yes, the Free Presbyterian Church. After a secession in 1893, led by the local minister, something like 90% of Raasay adhered to it. Its influence was all-consuming.
Which created a profound double-edged dynamic, didn't it, regarding both cultural preservation and political development?
A huge one. Let's start with the immediate cultural damage. The church actively undermined the very Gaelic traditions MacLean was absorbing at home.
How so?
It exercised these incredibly stringent cultural controls. It disapproved of and sometimes outright forbade music, dancing, song, and traditional rites. They were seen as secular distractions, or even worse, as dangerous vanities. And what's more, while the services themselves were often in Gaelic, the rigorous Bible readings, both individual and group, were based on the English King James Bible.
Ah, so that subtly elevates the status of English.
It does, as the language of true scriptural authority and learning, and that, in turn, weakens Gaelic's own intellectual register.
And doctrinally, this whole system seems almost designed to encourage political passivity, or what the sources call quietism, especially regarding social injustice like the clearances.
Precisely. The doctrinal emphasis was on a fierce individualism. Personal salvation was paramount, and there was this belief in a small, predetermined elect.
So if your fate is already determined by God, and worldly matters don't really compare to the afterlife.
There's very little incentive for organized material political action against things like land eviction or poverty.
Right, it reinforces political conservatism, and acceptance of the status quo.
It does. The Free Presbyterian mindset often focused that emotional intensity inward towards spiritual anguish and self-scrutiny, rather than outward toward revolutionary change.
But, and this is the fascinating claim of the sources, the step from that Free Presbyterian rigor to left-wing radicalism wasn't necessarily a large one. How could it possibly be?
It's all in the shared methodology and the psychological profile it attracted. The rigor of the church demanded this relentless, passionate, personal questioning of scripture and morality.
So it was inherently an anti-establishment posture.
In terms of religious authority, yes. You answered only to God and your own conscience. A man named John McInnes, a keen observer of Highland life, he noted that MacLean was not the only free Presbyterian Marxist in Raasay.
That's an incredible thought.
It is. The psychological intensity and the reliance on these rich, earnest Gaelic registers, which were, deadly serious, even when discussing salvation, they provided the passion and the linguistic tools you needed to condemn oppression.
So the discipline and the passion used to critique moral failings could just be transposed.
Easily transposed to critique social and political feelings. Absolutely. It provided the template for a kind of revolutionary seriousness. It taught you that the status quo, whether it's moral or material, has to be scrutinized and judged against a higher, uncompromising standard.
And when MacLean brought his extensive knowledge of Highland history, the clearances, the exploitation, into contact with that rigor,
the result was a clear rejection of social elitism, which is, of course, a core tenet of Marxism. The rejection of the small spiritual elect naturally led to a rejection of the small, powerful economic and political elite.
And that political rejection came astonishingly early for him. It's tied directly to his primary school experience.
It is. He attended Raasay Primary from 1918 to 1924, and the curriculum was completely English-centric, glorifying British imperialism.
And he barely spoke English at first.
Hardly a word. So he was just saturated in the official British narrative, glorifying naval heroes like Nelson, celebrating figures like Wellington. The literature often promoted a kind of romantic conservatism.
But the turning point, the moment he embraced socialism, was very specific. He was 12.
It was a direct, almost visceral confrontation between the official history he was learning and his own ancestral memory. He recalled going fishing with his uncle and discussing his history texts, maybe saying something favorable about Disraeli over Gladstone.
And his uncle's reaction was explosive.
It was an instant ancestral condemnation that just pierced that whole imperial narrative. He just said, the bloody Tories who did the clearances.
Wow. That one phrase, it connects contemporary political labels to this deep, localized, historical trauma. It must have been like a lightning rod.
It really was. MacLean says that this Highland slant, this immediate personal connection to historical injustice, made him see the world in black and white. It wasn't an abstract theory he read in a book. It was an ideology derived from an ancestral memory of suffering.
So he immediately rejected the school curriculum.
Immediately. He rejected it, and as he put it, he embraced socialism. The clearances became the foundational source text for his entire political consciousness.
And his later justification for rejecting Presbyterianism itself, it followed a similar path, didn't it? Rejecting elitism and validating the arts.
Right. It was a rejection not only of the political conservatism, but of the aesthetic restrictions, that condemnation of the arts as dangerous vanities.
And there was a more personal reason, too.
Yes, and it's quite poignant. He rejected the philosophical elitism and the concept of the elect. specifically because of the inevitable heartbreak of believing that most of the lovable people he knew in his community were probably destined for damnation.
So his journey toward Marxism was a path toward validating human worth, historical materialism, and the artistic life the church tried to suppress.
That's it in a nutshell.
So after these formative years, MacLean goes to Edinburgh University in 1929. And interestingly, he chose to pursue honors English language and literature, not a full Celtic studies degree.
Which is strange on the face of it.
Right, given that his heart and his language were so clearly Gaelic.
Well, this choice speaks volumes about the pragmatic constraints that were facing scholars of Gaelic culture in the 1930s.
It was a career choice.
It was a career choice. He initially hoped to write a critical work on P.B. Shelley, whose humane socialism and revolutionary fire he really admired. He avoided a full Celtic studies degree because, frankly, there were almost no job openings in Celtic departments.
He was hedging his bets.
Consciously, hedging his bets toward a more stable career, probably in teaching, rather than pure academic scholarship.
So his academic life, at least initially, was dedicated to European classics and the English tradition.
Yes, while his native interest in Celtic studies was sort of relegated to ordinary classes, alongside French.
And he'd already absorbed a lot of the classical tradition in secondary school.
A great deal. A great love for Virgil and Horace. He was reading French poets from Villon to Verlaine. He did later regret that he could only read Greek poetry in translation, unlike his brother, but he was already thoroughly grounded in the major European literatures.
And what was the immediate literary climate at Edinburgh that was shaping him at this time? This is the era of modernism, which often clashed with that perceived sentimentality of the Celtic Twilight movement.
The climate was completely dominated by the towering influence of Professor Herbert Grierson.
And he championed.
He championed the rigor and the intellectual complexity of John Donne and the metaphysical poets. He advocated for a poetry that married passion with thought.
And MacLean was influenced by this.
Profoundly, and by the wider intellectual tendency among the undergraduates to look beyond the syllabus. They were devouring the challenging, fragmented, experimental early work of T.S. Eliot, Ezra Pound.
Especially Hugh Selwyn Moberly, I believe.
Yes, and Gerard Manley Hopkins, whose stylistic density and linguistic innovation were just revolutionary.
So his initial poetic output reflected all this. It sounded derivative, self-consciously modernist, and it was all written in English.
Was.
So when did the great aesthetic and linguistic shift happen? When did he turn back to Gaelic?
The aesthetic watershed moment came in 1932. It was the composition of a single poem, A Cora Gritish.
The Heron.
The Heron, and it was an absolute aesthetic revelation for him. Writing this poem in Gaelic proved to him that he could achieve poetry that was deeper, more original, and simply better in his native tongue than he could ever hope to write in English.
Where he felt he was just mimicking others.
Exactly.
He felt he was just an echo in English.
And this aesthetic conviction was immediately layered with the political.
It was reinforced by what he called patriotic reasons. By 1932, his ideological leanings were firmly socialist and nationalist, so to write significant poetry in Gaelic was an act of cultural and political restoration.
A direct counter to centuries of suppression and decline.
Yes. From that moment on, he was committed almost entirely to Gaelic as his language of artistic expression.
Now, this shift required him to integrate these seemingly opposed forces. The deep traditional structures of Gaelic poetry and the revolutionary demands of European modernism. How on earth did he pull off that fusion? Well, this is the core of MacLean's achievement. He acted as a conduit. He didn't reject the past. He compounded the traditional Gaelic poetic models with European themes, with philosophical concepts, with modernist techniques.
So he's an innovator because he uses his tradition as the foundation.
Yes, integrating the emotional commitment of, say, a Bloch or a Baudelaire into forms that were uniquely and ancestrally Gaelic.
And how crucial in this decision was the example set by Hugh MacDiarmid, the lowland Scot committed to writing in synthetic Scots.
Hugely crucial. MacDiarmid, through his own commitment to writing in a Scottish language, even if it was a synthesized one, and his ardent support for Gaelic literature, he validated MacLean's own necessity of writing poetry in Scotland that was not in English.
MacLean held him in very high esteem.
The highest. He saw MacDiarmid as the greatest living Scottish poet and, significantly, as an uncompromising socialist and Scottish nationalist. MacDiarmid provided the proof that Indigenous language poetry could be both modern and politically radical.
So, MacLean's poetry is defined by this method of using Gaelic tradition to process global movements. Let's look at the specifics of how he innovated using these traditional forms.
Okay, so you can kind of break it down into, say, three main ways he did this. First, there's the intellectual rewriting of established Gaelic texts.
Give us an example.
Okay, so in the poem Dàin Excel, MacLean takes the traditional hopeful Gaelic song, Morún Gil Delias.
And that song contains the optimistic line, "An ebb tide never came without a flood."
Exactly, a very hopeful sentiment, and MacLean bitterly negates it. He reverses the sentiment line by line, contrasting that traditional hopefulness with the irreversible reality of Trea Bais, the ebb of death.
He takes the very language of hope and turns it into a meditation on finality.
He does. He's engaging in a critical dialogue with his own cultural memory, not just preserving it.
Okay, what about the language itself? The second method.
That leads to the restoration of language. McInnes noted that a huge part of his genius lies in the restorative work he performed on the Gaelic language.
His diction was famously dense.
And demanding. He was reclaiming words that had fallen out of use. He was weaving together registers that span from the everyday demotic speech of Raasay to the arcane scholarly vocabulary of historical Gaelic texts. To read MacLean in the original is to experience a linguistic richness that just regenerates the expressive power of the tongue.
Making the English translation often seems skeletal by comparison.
Yes.
And finally, the reframing of panegyric. Historically, panegyric verse was focused on the clan hierarchy, on heroic warriors. MacLean repurposes it.
He completely reformulated it. He did this by compounding the traditional Gaelic praise form, which often uses this accumulation of descriptive adjectives, with immediate European political and aesthetic concepts.
Can you give an example of that?
Take Dàin IV. He uses the traditional style to create this seductive accumulation of adjectives for Eimhir's hair.
Eimhir being his poetic beloved.
Yes. And her hair stands for the poetic convention of love, beauty, idealized form. But then he juxtaposes this aesthetic focus against the Guarna Opa, the cry of Europe, the reality of the Spanish Civil War.
So the poem forces the reader and the speaker into an ethical choice.
Is indulging in the traditional beauty of love poetry an act of negligence? Or complicity in the face of global suffering? The very act of praising Eimhir is morally complicated by the conflict raging abroad.
And this fusion goes beyond just verbal structures. It goes into the deeper layers of Highland musical heritage, specifically the big music, Kilmore.
Pibroch, yes. This is where the synthesis gets truly architectural. MacLean saw the Pibroch structure, the great classical music of the pipes, as a source of immense emotional and structural power.
And he integrated this into his poetry.
Structurally. In Crabnan Tude, the Tree of Strings, he integrates the pipe music form. Now, for those who might not be familiar, a pibroch is built around a theme called the Urlar or floor.
And that's followed by a series of variations.
A highly disciplined and emotionally intense series of variations. So you state the emotional theme, the suffering, the heroism, and then you explore its facets through this structured repetition and variation. The poem itself mirrors that development.
And he uses pipers as spiritual and artistic touchstones.
He does. He focuses on figures like Patrick Moore MacCrimmon, whose family line famously produced generations of great pipers.
And who suffered a terrible personal tragedy.
He lost 7 of his 8 children to tuberculosis in a single year. And MacLean saw MacCrimmon as the exemplar of artistic excellence born from profound, verifiable emotional commitment and intense suffering. This high requirement for emotional verity, that art must be born out of deep human reality, that became MacLean's requirement for truly realistic art.
Separating his work from the sentimentality of the Celtic twilight.
Completely.
So we're now entering the period between 1932 and 1943. This is the intense creative decade that produced the Dàin du Eimhir sequence.
Yes.
And we see all these elements, traditional form, modernist technique, political radicalism, and they all seem to focus on one central, almost agonizing conflict.
That's the core drama. The seemingly irreconcilable tension between, on the one hand, this intensely personal, idealized love for a woman, and on the other, the uncompromising, absolute necessity of political commitment.
Specifically to revolutionary socialism.
Yes. And this sequence uses the context of post-depression Britain, the threat of fascism, and the Spanish Civil War as the backdrop for an intensely personal, moral, and ethical battle.
Okay, let's start with the political demands. When the Spanish Civil War broke out in July 1936, MacLean was teaching in Portree. He felt ideologically committed to the Republican cause.
He did.
What prevented him from joining the International Brigade?
It was not a lack of ideological will. He and his colleague, Jack Stewart, were ideologically poised to go, What held him back were purely practical yet deeply rooted family obligations.
Family.
By 1936, his mother had become ill, and his father's business was struggling significantly in the Depression. MacLean's income from teaching was absolutely vital to supporting his parents and ensuring his siblings could complete their education.
His personal responsibility was a non-negotiable anchor.
It was. Which is a powerful irony, isn't it? The very traditional family structure he was trying to preserve, the roots of his Gaelic identity, was what prevented him from achieving the revolutionary socialist action his poetry demanded.
A profound irony.
And MacLean handles this real-life conflict by transforming it into poetic drama. In the poem An Cuilithionn the Choice, the narrative substitutes the, prosaic, necessary duty of family care with the romantic dilemma of choosing between political action and love for a woman.
So the poem elevates the stakes.
It does. It turns a logistical problem into a moral, existential choice worthy of a tragic hero, allowing him to explore the guilt and anguish of remaining politically inactive.
So let's talk about the figure at the center of this dilemma, Eimhir. The sources stress she is a seminal, a courtly pseudonym.
Right.
Who or what does Eimhir truly represent in the sequence?
Eimhir is not one single person. She's a composite, an ideal figure of womanhood, conflating at least 3 different women MacLean was involved with during the 1930s.
The longest and most significant attachment was to Nessa Ní Seachta, I believe.
A pious Dubliner whom he met in 1937. His affection was unrequited, which, often fuels the intensity of courtly love poetry. The seminal functions to elevate the beloved beyond mundane reality, placing her in this rarefied, idealized space.
And the poetic structure relies entirely on the conventions of amour courtois, or courtly love.
It does. Eimhir is superior to the lover. Love is an ever unsatisfied desire, and the pursuit is initially framed as an ennobling force. But MacLean immediately starts to subvert this.
No.
The idealism is undermined by what the sources call traces of composition. There's this sudden, unexplained shift in hair color between Dàin IV, where she is yellow-haired, and Dàin V, where she is red-haired.
Which forces the reader to confront the fact that Eimhir is not a fixed, unique individual.
She's a deliberately constructed ideal, a projection.
And that idealization breaks down completely in the later poems with the introduction of that really disturbing image, the comme sûreté.
The tortured or broken body.
Yes.
The focus on Eimhir's tortured body, or Cullen Ruta torn body, which becomes dominant from Dàin XL onwards, is a crucial shift.
Biographically, this imagery followed an emotional breakdown MacLean suffered.
After a particular rejection by a Scottish woman, yes. But philosophically, it connects directly back to his requirement for brave realism. The idealization of courtly love, the ethereal, untouchable perfection, is shattered by the reality of decay, physical suffering, and human vulnerability.
It's his recognition that true art has to confront suffering.
Even if that suffering is inherent in the object of his desire. Love, in his poetry, rarely allows for simple happiness. It has to be unrequited and painful, turning the traditional courtly ideal into a vehicle for profound self-mortification and torment.
Let's explore that direct clash between his political zeal and his personal longing. In Dàin VIII, the prayer poem, the narrator expresses profound guilt.
Dàin VIII Raanay prayer is an intense moment of self-condemnation. The narrator feels he's condemned to a death-like life because he committed the political sin of preferring a woman to crescent history.
The comparison is stark. He failed to strip his heart bare of human affection.
As his great political heroes had done. These Promethean martyrs like Julian Cornford, the English poet who died fighting in Spain, or Georgy Dimitrov, the Bulgarian communist hero, he saw them as having transcended personal needs for the sake of the cause.
He viewed them as almost superhuman.
As titans of political virtue, exactly. And by contrast, his own lingering love makes him feel small, selfish, and fundamentally lacking the moral purity required for true revolutionary action. The guilt is existential.
And the political conflicts sometimes involve Eimhir's perceived ideology too. In Dàin VIII, he expresses a fear of her politics, relating it directly to the Civil War.
That is the moment where the personal and political align most painfully. MacLean references this unsettling image of the steel helmet on my darling's very beautiful head.
And this stems from his fear, or his anxiety, that Eimhir, a pious Catholic, might be conservative.
Maybe even pro-Franco, which was a common alignment among some conservative Catholics during the Spanish Civil War. The steel helmet becomes the perfect, devastating emblem for the political gulf that idealism cannot bridge.
How can you love someone whose political leanings align, even abstractly, with the fascism you're dedicated to destroying?
You can't. Or at least the poem suggests you can't, without immense internal conflict.
Yet, amidst this torturous binary of love versus socialism, his Scottish nationalism seems to stand consistently apart.
It operates as the uncontested foundation. MacLean's nationalism was consistent and often interwoven with his political identity, but it does seem to transcend that immediate love-socialism conflict.
How so?
In Dàin XXX and Boisipak the Bolshevik, the narrator proclaims himself a Bolshevik who rejects all royalty. However, he concludes that despite his ideology, he would still proclaim Eimhir Queen of Scotland.
So nationalism provides this stable, determined geographic and cultural space.
It's the fixed point, the cultural imperative that has to survive regardless of personal choices or global political outcomes.
Finally, we have to look at his major ideological reversal during the war regarding his support for Soviet communism. His early Marxism was highly idealistic.
It really was. It was fueled by a romantic vision of history. These Promethean figures like Lenin and Stalin symbolizing hope for the oppressed, even if that involved, liquidating kulaks.
And that idealism was shattered in 1944.
It was. He had a discussion with the poet Sidney Goodsir Smith, who convinced him of the facts surrounding the Warsaw Uprising.
Can you tell us about that specific incident and why it caused such a moral collapse for MacLean?
Well, during the Warsaw Uprising in 1944, the Polish Home Army, which was aligned with the West, rose against the Nazi occupation. The Red Army was strategically positioned just across the Vistula River. They were within earshot of the fighting.
So they could have helped.
They could have. But Smith argued, and MacLean came to believe, that the Soviets deliberately halted their advance. They blocked Western aid, and they allowed the German army to systematically crush the Polish resistance and destroy Warsaw.
That is a brutal display of strategic cruelty.
It's a fundamental betrayal of the revolutionary humanism MacLean championed.
And his reaction?
He immediately became politically as well as aesthetically disgusted with institutional communism. The Promethean hero cult he had idealized just collapsed under the weight of political cynicism and state ruthlessness.
And he claimed he never spoke favorably of Russian communism after that date.
Never. And this ideological collapse created a significant problem for his most ambitious work, which was, at that time, built around a very pro-Soviet vision.
That moment of profound political disgust brings us directly to his complicated relationship with the epic poem, particularly An Cuilithionn, the Cuillin. MacLean held a rather unconventional view of the long poem format.
He did. He argued that the lyric was the pinnacle of poetry.
The brief, intense burst of emotion.
He saw that as the summit of all poetry. The long poem was, in his view, a necessary evil. It was dictated by the need to discuss great historical subjects, but it was philosophically flawed.
He subscribed to that theory held by critics like Croce and Poe.
That a long poem can only succeed through a succession of intense, brief, poetical effects or lyrical peaks. Anything else risks just descending into mere prose or narrative scaffolding.
Which puts him right in the middle of the 20th century modernist dilemma. How do you achieve coherence when the world itself is fragmented?
An Cuilithionn was his attempt to answer that. It was conceived as radiating geographically and ideologically from his native sky outward to Europe.
And it was aimed at overcoming Nazi fascism with a Marxist vision.
He deliberately sought to impose overarching narrative coherence. This is something modernists like Eliot in The Wasteland or Pound in the Cantos often avoided.
How did he structure it?
He used a clear allegorical structure. The glorious, heroic Cuillin Mountains, representing the enduring, uncorrupted spirit of the Highlands and communism, overcoming the sluggish, bourgeois marbling bog.
And this was underpinned by a Marxist historical perspective.
Buttressed by lists of Gaelic heroes and place names to ground the vision in local, continuous history.
So he fought fragmentation with a defined ideological and geographic narrative. But then, ironically, his own later political disillusionment led to the poem's history of publication, mirroring the very fragmentation he tried to avoid.
Precisely. His post-1944 revulsion meant he could no longer stand by the poem's aggressive, pro-Soviet ideological framework. He felt it relied too heavily on a hero cult of Promethean martyrs and demanded a credulous attitude towards socialism rather than, reasoned political argument.
So by refusing to sanction its full publication for decades,
he effectively suppressed and fragmented his own epic. The later republications, which often appeared as these short, disconnected extracts, made the poem look structurally like the very modernist, unstable text he had intended to transcend.
While his ideological epic was collapsing, he was experiencing the reality of war firsthand. He joined the Signal Corps in 1940 and was serving in North Africa.
Right.
How did army life inform his socialist views?
It was confirmation, not a conversion. His army service, so far from home, provided stark evidence of what he called vile, cast-iron, bourgeois class rule in the British Army. He saw the rigid class hierarchies, the unquestioning obedience, the contempt for the common soldier.
And paradoxically, the physical exertion of army life was also a release for him.
It was a temporary escape from the intense personal and romantic turmoil of the Dàin Eimhir period.
And this military experience allowed him to complete the political inversion of the panegyric tradition he'd started earlier.
It really did. It allowed him to fully appropriate the traditional panegyric, which usually celebrates the elite, high-status warrior, and consecrate it to the ordinary, low-ranked soldier.
And this is in his great poem, Dàin.
Heroes, yes. In it, he elegizes a specific English private soldier whose courage was immense, but whose name would otherwise have been completely forgotten by history. It completely overturns the social hierarchy.
And the fact that this soldier was English and low-ranked was crucial.
It was. MacLean recognized that universal heroism resided not in title or clan status, but in simple, common human bravery. The form is traditional, but the subject is radically socialist.
His war poetry is also noted for a deep, humanist realism that entirely rejected wartime propaganda.
Absolutely. He was geographically far from Scotland, yet he wrote about the universal experience of suffering. The desert itself became a symbolic setting, an indifferent, alienating no place far from the sentimental mythologies of Scotland.
It was a foreign sand in history, spoiling the machines of the mind.
What a line. And the most powerful instance of this anti-propaganda humanism is in Glacabai's Death Valley, where he encounters a dead German soldier.
Tell us about the nature of that encounter.
Well, instead of the ideological hatred promoted by both sides, MacLean's speaker is filled with a profound sense of kinship. He recognizes that the common soldier, whether British or German, is being led unwillingly to the trial for the sake of rulers.
That realization broke down any simplistic racial or national stereotypes he might have held.
It did. His army experience confirmed that the ordinary soldier is not any kind of ist at all, not necessarily a fascist or a communist or imperialist, but a human being caught in the machinery of great power conflict. This focus on shared victimhood is the defining feature of his war realism.
This demand for objective clarity, this rejection of comforting illusion, it connects back to a subtle note in the source material about MacLean's interest in scientific rigor, even if he rejected philosophical materialism.
Yes.
We can draw an interesting parallel here with Charles Hamilton Sorley, the WWI poet, who also insisted on a kind of scientific truth over sentimentality.
That parallel is extremely productive. MacLean, although he was skeptical of hard materialism and philosophy, consistently demanded clarity and honesty, a kind of scientific rigor in poetry, which he termed brave realism.
And Sorley insisted that truth, the goal of both philosophical and scientific inquiry, must supersede comforting illusion.
They shared a deep intellectual commitment to objectivity.
Sorley's famous quote about the morality of literature reinforces this shared anti-sentimentalism. He said, "Anyone who calls a book immoral or moral should be caned. A book by itself can be neither."
It is only a question of the morality or immorality of the reader. That is the epitome of materialist clarity and anti-sentimental realism. And MacLean's lifelong battle was precisely against the vapid dream of the Celtic twilight.
That sentimental, nostalgic, often historically dishonest portrayal of the Highlands.
Exactly. Like Sorley, he saw that sentimentality was a dangerous illusion that prevented genuine engagement with historical and material reality. His commitment to reclaiming Gaelic traditions required this brave realism, locating history, poverty, and suffering directly within the landscape and language.
Demanding an objective gaze that honors the intensity of human experience without resorting to comforting myth. He transformed the Gaelic tradition by forcing it to look outward and unflinchingly inward at the same time.
And that philosophical requirement for truth, that shared commitment to the material reality of war and suffering, that is the bedrock upon which MacLean built his lasting literary achievement. So, to try and synthesize Sorley MacLean's monumental legacy, I think his unique genius really lay in its structural tension. He was profoundly and intensely Gaelic, rooted in the geography, the history, the language, the musical traditions of his island home, Raasay.
Yet, at the same time, he was fiercely engaged with the most radical, global, and aesthetic movements of the 20th century.
And his struggle between his own idealized love and the revolutionary necessity of political action. That became the essential dramatic engine for all of his best work.
So he didn't just write about the Highlands. He used the ancestral poetic codes, the density of the language, the architecture of the pibroch, the panegyric structure, and he turned them into a vehicle for a socialist, humanist, and modernist vision of human suffering and hope.
He made the history of the clearances and the politics of Spain two sides of the same coin.
United by the suffering of the common person.
Yes. He ensured that places like the Cuilithionns or the woods near Osgag were not merely settings, but symbolic landscapes, imbued with long historical memory and immediate political weight.
And by focusing on the anonymous suffering, be it the dead MacCrimmon children or the forgotten German soldier, he gave voice to the common human experience, a task traditional history so often ignores.
I think so.
This leaves us with a final provocative thought, based on MacLean's later evolution. His profound masterpiece, Haleg, focuses almost entirely on what he called native symbolism. It draws symbols solely from the intensely localized landscape and history of the Highlands, the names of the dead, the contours of the abandoned village. So if a symbol is drawn exclusively from a local source, a single island, a single glen, a single historical trauma, can it still achieve the universal nerve that MacLean reached? Or is universality inherently dependent upon that unflinching commitment to localized specific truth, bravely rendered in a threatened tongue?
That's a fitting question. I think MacLean proves that perhaps the deepest truth is always found in the smallest, most specific place, provided the analysis is honest enough.
Making Raasay the mirror of Europe.
That is his great paradox.
Thank you for joining us for the deep dive.